We love a good ghost story. We like the idea of a hitchhiker or a lady in white. They're human, they have motives we understand. Revenge, sadness, maybe unfinished business. But there's a different kind of haunting. One that doesn't involve floorboards creaking or lights flickering. It's a haunting of the mind. A slow motion train wreck where the victim doesn't even realise they're off the tracks until the fire starts. Today we're looking at the case of The King in the Room. It's a story that's been passed around occult circles for decades, often attributed to a young man named David in the mid-1970s. It's a story that ends in a locked ward, but it starts with something as simple as a book. David was a skeptic's skeptic. A graduate student in archaeology, he viewed the ancient world as a puzzle to be solved, not a power to be feared. In 1974, while cataloguing a private collection in upstate New York, he came across a handwritten copy of the Ars Goetia. Now, for those who don't know, the Goetia is the first section of the Lesser Key of Solomon. It's essentially a who's who of the 72 spirits supposedly bound by King Solomon. Essentially, a blueprint of demonology. David, being a man of science, decided to conduct an experiment. He didn't believe in demons. He believed in the power of human ritual. He followed the instructions of the ninth spirit, King Paimon. He drew the circle, he wore the leman, he faced the northwest and expected nothing. But that night, the air in his apartment changed. It got thick. He described it like walking through invisible honey. And then came the sound. A faint, rhythmic thumping, like a drum playing miles away, accompanied by a high-pitched ringing that made his teeth ache. Over the next week, David stopped sleeping. Not because of fear, but because he couldn't find the off switch. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw a desert. A vast, shimmering wasteland of black sand under a sun that didn't give off any light. And in the desert, a procession was moving. He saw two men in crowns leading a camel, and on that camel sat a figure with a face so beautiful, David found it to be terrifying. A face that seemed to shift between male and female with every blink. This was King Paimon. The haunting moved into the physical world. David's friends said he started speaking in a roar, a voice that sounded like several people talking all at once, distorted and overlapping. He began to obsess over the northwest corner of his room, stacking books and furniture there like an altar. He claimed the king wasn't haunting him, he was teaching him. Paimon is the master of all arts and sciences. David began solving complex mathematical theorems he had never studied. He spoke fluent Arabic, a language he had never even heard. But as his mind expanded, his body began to wither. He stopped eating. He stopped bathing. He told his sister, "The trumpets are too loud. I have to go where it's quiet." On November 12th, the police found him. He had carved the sigil of Paimon into his own chest with a fountain pen. He was staring at the northwest corner of the room, smiling, and when they asked him who he was, he couldn't give his name. He just whispered, "The king is pleased." It's a chilling tale. It has all the elements: the skeptical victim, the ancient book, tragic descent. But we have to ask ourselves, what actually happened? Some people suggest it was an example of the tulpa effect, the power of suggestion. David was an archaeology student. He knew the lore. When you deeply immerse yourself in a ritual, especially one involving sleep deprivation, your brain enters a state called hypersuggestibility. The roar he heard? That's a common auditory hallucination linked to temporal lobe epilepsy. When the temporal lobe misfires, victims often report hearing divine music, loud rushing sounds, or multiple voices. If you've been reading about King Paimon and his trumpets, guess what your brain is going to interpret the seizure as? Others suggest that maybe David was in greater danger. Remember that private collection David was cataloguing? Ancient manuscripts and artifacts from that era were often preserved using mercury and arsenic. Chronic mercury poisoning, Mad Hatter's disease, causes tremors, extreme emotional instability, speech distortion, and most tellingly, hallucinations. David wasn't being possessed by a king of the Northwest. He was likely breathing in a 200-year-old toxic dust. If this story sounds familiar, it's probably because it's the skeleton of almost every modern Paimon creepypasta. The film Hereditary even took those scattered true accounts and distilled them into a pop culture nightmare. The reality is, there is no evidence of a David in the 1974 Connecticut police records that fits this description. The story is a modern apocrypha, a tale that grows on the telling, fueled by our collective fear of losing our minds to something we invited in. We want to believe that evil is an external force, a king on a camel coming to take our souls. It's easier to fight a demon and a camel than it is to fight a chemical imbalance or a fracturing psyche. But maybe that's the real trap of the Goetia. The book tells you that you're summoning a spirit, but what you're actually doing is maybe opening a door into the basement of your own consciousness. And once you start poking around in the dark with a flashlight, you might not like what looks back. Whether Paimon is an ancient entity or just a name we give our own burgeoning madness, the result is the same. David didn't lose his soul to a demon. He lost himself to an idea. And ideas are the things that are truly immortal. In a quiet field in Ireland, archaeologists uncovered 2 medieval graves that didn't quite match the rest. Both bodies were buried normally, except for one detail that suggested that the people who put them there were afraid that they might come back. The site is called Kiltee in County Roscommon. It dates back to the early medieval period, around the 8th century. At first glance, it looked like a typical burial ground. Simple graves with no elaborate markers, no obvious signs of violence. But when archaeologists began excavating, 2 burials immediately stood out. Each skeleton had a large stone deliberately forced into its mouth. Not placed gently, not resting there by accident. Forced deep enough so that the jaw could not close. This wasn't damage caused by time or soil pressure. The positioning was intentional. Whoever buried these men wanted their mouths sealed. In medieval Europe, this meant one thing: the fear of the revenant, the restless dead. Long before the word vampire existed in Ireland, there was a widespread belief that certain people could return after death. Not as ghosts, but as physical beings, walking corpses, hungry, dangerous, capable of spreading illness, misfortune, or death. These beings weren't supernatural predators with fangs and capes. They were neighbours, family members, people who had died wrong. In Irish folklore, they were sometimes called the Marv Vio, the living dead. And the mouth mattered more than anything else. The mouth was how a revenant fed, how it spoke curses, how it spread its plague. Blocking it was protection. What makes the Kiltee burials especially disturbing is that nothing else about them suggested punishment. The bodies weren't decapitated, their limbs weren't bound, they weren't buried face down, which was another common preventative measure. They were laid out like everyone else, which suggests something important. These individuals were not criminals, they were not executed, they were just feared. Archaeologists believe men that may have been outsiders, possibly of Norse origin, but there's no definitive proof. What is clear is that the community believed these two people posed a threat after death, not during their life. And that fear was strong enough to override normal burial customs. This wasn't a panic, it was a procedure. Similar practices appear across medieval Europe. In Poland, stones were placed in throats. In Italy, bricks were forced into mouths. In England, iron stakes were driven through torsos. The methods differ, but the logic is the same. To stop the dead from rising, stop the dead from feeding, to stop the dead from speaking. Ireland rarely appears in vampire history discussions, which is why Kill Tishin matters. It shows that the fear of the revenant wasn't imported later through Gothic literature. It was already here, embedded in belief systems centuries earlier, and it wasn't fringe folklore. This fear existed alongside Christianity. The people who buried these men likely attended church. They believed in heaven and hell, but they also believed that some souls didn't move on cleanly, that death wasn't always the end of a person's influence. Medieval life was brutal, disease was poorly understood, crops failed, children died suddenly. When something went wrong, people looked for causes. And sometimes the dead were to blame. A single death could spiral into a fear of if misfortune followed. Someone dies, illness spreads, livestock fails, and the solution isn't prayer alone, it's containment. That's what makes these burials chilling. They represent a moment when fear outweighed ritual, when the community quietly agreed we cannot take the risk. No records named these men, no stories survived explaining who they were, what they did. All that remains is the evidence of what people believed might happen if they weren't stopped. And that's the unsettling part, because nothing in these graves proves these men were dangerous, only that they were believed to be. Over time, the idea of vampires evolved. Literature added drama, teeth became fangs, the revenant became immortal. Kill Tishin reminds us of the original fear, not of monsters, but of the familiar becoming hostile after death. Someone you knew, someone you buried, someone who might not stay buried. Today the site is quiet again. Grass grows where fear once dictated ritual. The stones remain in place, still doing the job they were meant to do over 1,000 years ago. Not to punish the dead, but to protect the living. And that fear, the idea that death might not be final, is far older and far closer to home than most people realize. Some books are dangerous because of what they say. This one is dangerous because of what it cost. In a monastery in 13th century Bohemia, a monk was sentenced to a punishment so brutal it was meant to erase him from his existence. He was to be sealed inside a wall. No trial, no redemption, just slow, agonizing death. Faced with that fate, he made an impossible promise. He would create a book that contained all human knowledge, scripture, history, medicine, exorcisms, everything known to the world at the time. And he would finish it in a single night. By dawn, the book would be complete, or he would accept his fate. His fellow monks agreed, likely amused. One night was not enough to write a single gospel, let alone an encyclopedia of the world. But centuries later, the book exists. It's called the Codex Gigas. And it's so large, so strange and so unsettling that people still whisper the same explanation. No man could have done this alone. The Codex Gigas is not just old, it's enormous. Over 3 feet tall, a foot wide, weighing more than 70 kg. You don't
hold it in your hands, you stand over it, like you're confronting something. Its pages are made from the skins of more than 160 animals. Thick parchment, heavy and pale. The ink has barely faded in 800 years, and when you turn the pages, you begin to realize this is no ordinary manuscript. Inside is the complete Old and New Testaments, detailed historical chronicles, medical treatments, confessions of sins, instructions for exorcisms, magical formulas meant to protect against evil, remedies for illness, accounts of heaven and hell. It feels less like a religious text and more like somebody tried to trap the entire medieval world between two covers. And then you reach the page, the one that changed its name forever. On a full page alone, with no decorative border, no opposing illustration, stands a figure nearly the size of the page itself. Clawed hands, split hooves, two massive horns, a forked tongue, and eyes that seem far too deliberate. The devil himself. Not in battle, not tempting anyone, just standing there, staring out. It's this image that earned the Codex Gigas its nickname, the Devil's Bible. According to legend, as night wore on and the monk realized he could not possibly complete the task, panic set in. Candlelight burned low, his ink dried up, time slipped away. The walls that were meant to be his tomb loomed in his mind, and in that desperation he prayed, but not upward. He called on something else. The story says the devil himself answered. In exchange for his soul, the book would be finished before dawn, and to honour that pact, the monk included that portrait, a silent acknowledgement of who truly completed the work. It's a dramatic story, but what makes it even more unsettling is that even without the legend, the Codex is almost harder to explain. Modern analysis shows that the handwriting is consistent, from beginning to end. The same steady script, the same ink tone, no visible signs of aging or changing in style across hundreds of pages. Scholars believe it would have taken decades to complete, decades of sitting alone, writing, line after line, day after day, preserving perfect consistency. Imagine that level of focus, isolation, obsession. One man devoting the prime of his life to a single book. It's easier perhaps to blame the devil than to accept this kind of relentless human dedication exists. The Codex did not remain hidden in a monastery forever. During the 30 Years' War, Swedish soldiers looted it and carried it back to Stockholm. It became a trophy, an object of fascination. Then in 1697, fire consumed the royal castle. Flames tore through the structure, beams collapsed, smoke filled the halls. In the chaos, someone threw the Codex from the window to save it. It survived. Not perfectly. Its binding was damaged. Several pages were lost, torn away at some point in its history. Those missing pages have fueled centuries of speculation. What was written on them? Rituals? Forbidden confessions? Something deliberately removed? Or nothing extraordinary at all? And it's our imagination that fills the gaps. Even today, the book rests in Stockholm, preserved behind glass. Visitors approach with curiosity, but they rarely leave unaffected. There's something about its scale, its weight, its silence. And then there's the page. The devil does not look chaotic. He doesn't look triumphant. He looks patient, almost calm. And maybe that's why the legend persists. Because the Codex Gigas isn't frightening in the way horror stories are frightening. It's frightening because it forces a question. What would someone give to create something that lasts forever? If Herman the Recluse truly existed, he may not have made a pact. He may have simply chosen a life of extraordinary, isolating dedication.
A life spent copying texts, preserving knowledge, and building something monumental. But the human mind struggles with scale like this, with effort like this, ambition like this. So stories develop, stories of bargains in the dark, souls exchanged for ink and parchment. Stories that make the impossible feel explainable. 800 years later, the Codex Gigas still survives. Wars couldn't destroy it, fires couldn't destroy it, and time hasn't erased it. And whether it was written by a monk alone in candlelit cell, or completed by something far more sinister, one thing is certain. When you stand before it, and look into that painted face staring back at you, it's very easy to understand why people believed no ordinary man could have made it. And maybe that's the most powerful part of this story. Not that the devil helped write the book, but that we needed him to.
In the wild, there is no such thing as a sin. There's only calories in, calories out. A praying mantis decapitates her mate mid-act, a lion consumes a rival's cub without a second thought. In the brutal mathematics of survival, meat is just meat. Nature doesn't have a conscience, it has an appetite. But what about me, I hear you say? Well, I've been told that the act of consuming our own kind is an ultimate evil. The one line you can't cross without shattering your own soul, like Voldemort did. We spent thousands of years building civilizations on the single rule that humans are off the menu. But why? Is it just a social contract we've signed to keep the peace? Or is there something deeper? A terrifying biological kill switch buried in our DNA that punishes us for even trying? So grab your knife and fork, because today we are dissecting the darkest taboo of humanity. From the desperate starvation of the Andes air disaster to the bone-chilling laughter of death of the four people we're investigating: cannibalism. The primary reason we can't cross this line isn't morality. It's nature. A biological nightmare called prions exists to ruin all of the neighbour-eating fun. Unlike a virus or bacteria, a prion isn't even alive. It has no DNA. It can't be killed by heat, radiation, or even industrial-strength disinfectant. It's a misfolded protein, a glitch in the very building blocks of life. As a result, when you consume the nervous tissue of your own species, those rogue proteins act like a zombie instruction for the mind. They force all of your healthy proteins to misfold too, creating a catastrophic chain reaction that literally eats holes in your brain, turning your grey matter into a fluid-filled sponge, which doesn't sound too appealing to me. We actually saw this horror of the kill switch in the 1950s. The four people of Papua New Guinea were being decimated by a mysterious plague called Kuru. It became known to the outside world as the Laughing Death. Victims would lose control of their emotions, then their muscles, bursting into eerie, uncontrollable fits of laughter while their bodies literally wasted away. And by the time the laughter stopped, the brain was too far gone to sustain life. Nature has built-in guardrails for humans. The Kuru effect is a biological warning that says this meat was never meant for you. I don't know about you, I'm no longer feeling so hungry. So, if nature has such a deadly kill switch, why does a hamster consume its own young? Why can sand tiger sharks devour their siblings inside the womb before they're even born? Because that seems a bit unfair to me. Well, in the wild, cannibalism isn't a crime, it's down to resource management. In the cold, unfeeling logic of the forest, a mother animal sees her kids as a biological investment. So if she's starving, she eats the weakest of the litter to ensure the others survive. Dirty. It's nature's ultimate form of recycling. It's a survival strategy that has worked for millions of years. But if humans took a different path? We are social primates. Well, most of us. Our greatest evolutionary advantage wasn't our teeth, our claws, it was our ability to cooperate. Our survival didn't depend on eating each other, it depended on trusting one another. The moment a tribe allows the consumption of its own members, the social contract dissolves. You can't build a village, hunt a mammoth, protect a fire if you think your neighbour is looking at you like a steak. Evolution made a calculated trade. We gave up the easy calories of cannibalism for the power of a group. To become human, we had to make our own kind uneatable. We had to bake a physical and psychological revulsion into our brains so that we could sleep on the same side of the cave without fear. By making the forbidden flesh a taboo, we created the foundation of a civilization. We traded the snacks for a society. Lads, we're about to dive into the Wendigo psychosis, the moment where the brain actually snaps and starts craving human flesh. So hit that subscribe button now. Let's go. In the oral traditions of the Algonquian people, whatever it is, there is a shadow that haunts the frozen north, the Wendigo. Legends say it was once a man, a hunter, who, driven by the desperation of a brutal winter, consumed the flesh of his own kin to survive. But the meat didn't save him, it transformed him. He became a towering skeletal monster with a heart of ice and a hunger that grew larger with every bite. The more he ate, the more he starved, just like that sheep. But this isn't a campfire story to scare children. It's a chillingly accurate description of a psychological breakdown. Anthropologists call it Wendigo psychosis. When a human crosses that final line, even in a survival situation, like the famous 1972 Andes flight disaster, it fundamentally rewires your brain. You see, our minds are built with an empathy circuit. Well, again, most of us. It's a neurological hardware that allows us to see others as people rather than objects. To eat a human being, you have to do something terrifying to your mind. You have to dehumanize them. You have to flip a switch in your consciousness that turns a person into meat. Once you flip that switch, you can't always flip it back. And when you stop seeing others as human, you lose the ability to live in a society built on human connection. The Wendigo isn't a monster with fur and claws, because it's a skeleton. It's a shell of a person who's destroyed their own capacity for empathy. This is why every culture on Earth labels this act as evil. It's not just about the loss of life, it's about the destruction of the soul that follows. The physical meal is temporary, but the psychological heart of ice is permanent, and nobody in Whoville can save it. From the blood-soaked altars of the Aztecs to the rugged shores of the Vikings, every major culture on Earth eventually reached the same conclusion. It's a hard, unshakable no. Even in the most extreme dark history rituals, the act was rarely about the hunger. It was a sacred crime, a way to absorb an enemy's strength or desperate last resort during a siege. It was never considered normal. It was always understood as a transgression against the natural order. So stop it, Mr. Hanks. But what if it changed? If we were to normalize this practice today, society wouldn't just change, it would collapse within a week. We wouldn't be facing a medical crisis, we'd be facing a total breakdown of reality. The biological prions would rot our brains from the inside out, creating a global epidemic of the laughing death. But the psychological rot would be even worse. Because imagine you're in a world where your neighbour isn't a friend, but potentially a resource. It sounds pretty good to me, but paranoia would rot our cities faster than any disease. The social contract we've spent over 10,000 years perfecting would vanish. Lads, at the end of the day, cannibalism offers the promise of a quick meal to save your life, but it guarantees a slow, horrific death. So don't be at it. Thousands of years ago, our ancestors stood in the mouth of a cave and made a choice. They chose the warmth of a fire, the strength of the tribe, over the darkness of the forbidden flesh. But what do you think? In a moment of total desperation, is there ever a situation where this sacred crime could be justified? I probably wouldn't do it now, to be honest. After researching all of this, it sounds like an awful dose. But each to his own. If you want to watch anything else on the channel, have a look, and you have to subscribe. That's basically a rule now. Good luck.